Thanks for stopping by Clearview Community Church. My name is Pastor Zach. I'm one of the pastors here. And at the time we're recording this video, we are in the second week of Advent. Advent is this thing that happens all around the world. It's been happening actually since about 400 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And maybe for you, Advent is just a word that brings to mind little charts filled with chocolate. And at every store during the Christmas season, their checkout line is just full of these little chocolate things, and your children are standing beside you going, "Please, I need more chocolate." And maybe you have 4 of them at home, or maybe you've managed to avoid the temptation. But Advent is actually much more than this. It's not just some treat tradition that happens every year. Advent, in its original conception, is about the idea of anticipating and expecting the coming of a Messiah. It's to put ourselves in the place of those who came before Jesus as they were waiting and hoping and believing that God was going to come in and fulfill his promises to the people of Israel. It's a time for us to think and remember that God keeps his promises, and also a time for us to look forward and remember that Jesus has made a promise to come back again one day. And so as we kind of sit in how this was for the people before Jesus and what it means for us today to trust and believe in the promises of God, we are this week jumping into the faith of Advent. What does it mean to have faith in Advent? And I think that faith is actually one of the most exciting and the most applicable attributes throughout the Advent season to what Advent is really about. So we're going to read a brief passage in Luke chapter 2, just that little part at the beginning. And then we're going to dig into what does it mean to have faith in the season of Advent. So Luke writes this: "At the time of the Roman Emperor Augustus, he decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All returned to their ancestral towns to register for the census, and because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. He traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. He took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was now expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no lodging available for them." The faith of Advent. This is a crazy story where obviously Mary and Joseph have a lot of faith and trust in what God has said to them as they're going on this ridiculous journey. Having watched my wife give birth a couple times, I can't imagine what it would be like to go through that experience in a barn with a bunch of stinky animals. And what does it mean in the midst of this Christmas season to have faith in the season of Advent? I think first we need to look at what is faith. What does that word actually mean? Because in our culture and society today, we use it often in ways that is not really true of what it means when we read it in the Word of God throughout the scriptures. Today, people might say, "Oh, I have faith. We just have faith." And what they mean by that is that they don't really have much else to substantiate their belief. They're like, "Well, it doesn't really make sense, and I don't really understand it, but I have faith." And I mean, yes, there is some truth to that step of faith, but faith is actually not primarily based in a lack of evidence. Other people say faith, well, it's just something I think. I have faith because I understand that to be true, or I believe that to be true. And as you look at people like James, the brother of Jesus, and his teaching, they say that faith without works is dead. Faith is not just something that lives in our mind. It is something that fills our entire life and causes us to step out in action. Faith in the Old Testament, most of you, if you're watching this, you may or may not know that the Bible was actually written in no language that really gets used commonly today. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and unless you are a Jewish individual, you probably don't speak Hebrew. The word emet is the word that is often used in passages and verses where we see and talk about faith in God, but it's actually more accurately translated to the word faithfulness or truth. Again, it is not about just an absence of evidence. It's actually when we understand the truth about who God is, when we understand the faithfulness of God, we are able and willing to then put our faith in him. So in Advent, our faith is not based simply on just trusting. It is based on the fact that if we understand who God is and the understanding that he is faithful, then we are now willing as followers of his to put our faith in him. This concept carries on forward in the New Testament, where they write predominantly in an ancient version of Greek, and the word there for faith is either pistis or pistuo. These are sort of the noun and the verb, and I love this stuff, but I won't bore you with the details. But the first place we see this word used in the writings of the apostles is when Luke writes down and describes the faith that Mary had in the words of the angel. And we see that Mary was able to trust and believe that the words that God had sent to her, he would be faithful to fulfill. And so then she continues on in this journey, understanding that the faith of Advent, the faith as a follower of God, is understanding that he is faithful and he is more than able to bring us from where we are to where he wants us to be, no matter how crazy it might sound. And I think if we're really going to understand what the faithfulness of God looks like, especially in the eyes of Mary and Joseph as they're starting out this first Christmas, we have to look at the stories that they would have grown up hearing, the stories from the Old Testament. So we're going to quickly look at two different individuals from the Old Testament and how they help us to better understand the faithfulness of God. The first is Abraham. If you grew up in church, you might have heard a song that's like, Father Abraham, and then the Sunday school teacher makes you do this silly dance, and you really don't learn anything about Abraham other than he had a big family. But Abraham is one of the first people who trusts and follows God. The Apostle Paul writes this in the book of Romans. He says that Abraham was, humanly speaking, the founder of our Jewish nation. What did he discover about being made right with God? If his good deeds had made him acceptable to God, he would have had something to boast about. But that was not God's way, for the scriptures tell us that Abraham believed in God, and so God counted it as righteousness because of his faith. Romans 4. And so here Paul looks back and sees this man who was the father of his entire nation and says that he believed, he had trust in the faithfulness of God. What was that promise? What was it that he was being trusted with? And what was he trusting God for? God calls him out and says, I'm just going to need a little thing from you. You need to leave your entire family, your entire country, and come on a journey with me to a land that I will give to you. But God doesn't leave it there. He says that if Abraham were to trust and to follow, that he would bless him. And the promise ends with this line that whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And the people on earth will be blessed through you. Not some people, not most people. It says all people on earth will be blessed through you. The promise to Abraham was that his faithfulness, based on an understanding that God would be faithful, would bring about blessings to the entirety of the human race. And so faith is not just something that we think or something that is this idea of believing in something, but faith in its essence is a faith in God's faithfulness. Unfortunately, following Abraham and this promise, the people of Israel, Abraham's descendants, kind of get stuck in this indefinite loop where they're like, we will trust that God is faithful and we will do things the way he has asked us. And then they see something over here that's like, well, maybe this time we'll just try it. Well, this situation seems, I know God said to do this, but I think in this specific situation, it's better if we just try and figure it out on our own. Even Abraham a couple times ends up lying and trying to deceive the people around him because he thinks it's the easiest way forward, and it causes nothing but trouble. And so they get stuck in this cycle of believing in God, believing in his faithfulness, and then turning away from that, living their own way and ending up in just the worst situations that go from bad to worse to terrible. And once they're in the bottom of the bottom, they say, God, help. And because God is faithful, despite our faithlessness, he continuously reaches down, pulls them back up, and they start again. Thank you, God, so much. And they follow him, and they're excited. And then inevitably, they follow their own way again, and they go in this pattern. And as we look back, we can see this and say, wow, that was ridiculous. How could they do the same stupid thing again and again and again? And yet often each of us can do the same thing in our own life. As we're going towards Christmas, I've heard many people saying how they're starting a diet now so that they can have like 2 to 4 weeks of eating healthy. And then when they go to that Christmas gathering, they just eat and eat and eat. And then it helps relieve some of the guilt associated with that. How many of you like to eat? Do you like to eat at Christmas? Yeah. There's so many good foods, and you just are like, well, I'll just eat a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then in January, everyone goes to the gym for a day and then quits. And so even in our own lives, in this sort of less serious situation, we can end up in this weird cycle where we're like, well, I'll eat healthy. And there's people in my life who've been on a diet for as long as I have known them. And there's some people that are like, well, I've been dieting and I've been basically following all the rules for like a month, and somehow I've gained 5 pounds. And it's because like, yeah, maybe you follow the rules 80% of the time, but the one day that you break the rules, you just eat an entire cake in one sitting. And so in our life, sometimes we try our best, and occasionally we don't even really understand what it is that we're doing wrong. And a little lie, or just cutting a corner at work, or deceiving a family member, it's for their own good. They don't really need to know. They're not going to understand. And we can find ways to justify taking those little things and acting in a way that is against how God has asked us to live. And as the Israelites continue in this cycle, eventually they're in Egypt, and Moses comes in and he frees them from slavery, and they see the power of God sending plague after plague. The Red Sea is parted. They walk through on dry land, and the waves crash down on their enemies, and they dance and they celebrate. And I have a lot of empathy for Moses as a parent now of 2 little kids, because the entire journey of Moses through the wilderness towards the promised land, the Israelites sound like a bunch of whiny little children. They're like, Moses, we're hungry. Moses, we're thirsty. Moses, it would have been better if we just died in Egypt. Why are you dragging us on this long drive, this long walk? And yet Moses trusts in the faithfulness of God to get the people through. In Numbers 13, they finally get where they're going. They get to the promised land, and Moses sends some spies, some people to go scout out the land that is supposed to be overflowing in goodness, the food, the fruit, and everything in it. And as the people come back, they go to Moses and they say, yeah, it's amazing. The fruit is amazing. The honey is amazing, but we don't want to go because there are giants and fortified cities. And all of a sudden, these people who have seen God do incredible things throughout their own history look at a challenge ahead of them and say, I don't think God is going to get us through this. It's better that we leave. And we see 2 young men, Joshua and Caleb, who try and plead their case. They say, but if God is with us, we can get through this. And yet the Israelites are like, no, we're out. And I think each of us can sometimes be a little bit like this. We see something that we're like, we know the right thing to do here. We know this is probably what we should do, but it seems too hard. It seems too big. It seems too challenging. And we look at our own strength, and we look at our own convictions, our own moral guideposts, and we're like, I don't think I'm going to get through this. And we can forget that if God is the one who is bringing us there, he will be faithful to bring us through. The passage we read at the beginning in the book of Luke, it puts a big emphasis on the fact that Joseph is from the line of David. And if you've heard this before, often we talk about that and we're just like, yeah, it said the Messiah was going to come from the house of David. So Jesus came from the house of David. Check. Moving on. But there's a lot more significance to the story and the person of David in the history of the people of Israel that really helps us to understand even more the faithfulness of God and how our response to that faithfulness can help to bring about amazing things in our world. So when we see David, how many of you know what's the first time we see David? He jumps on the scene and he is in his fields and he goes to bring his brothers food and he's face to face with Goliath. Goliath, this giant who is standing against Israel, sounds very familiar to the story of the people who came to the promised land, saw some giants, and they were like, no, we don't trust God to get us through this, and they left. And now here there's a new young man in a new generation, again standing before a giant, saying, God will get me through this. The king is hiding, the soldiers are hiding, all of the adults and the people who should be stepping up and trusting in God are hiding in fear. And yet David, this one young man, changes the whole trajectory of his people as he says, God will get me through. And he looks at Goliath and says, you trust in your own weapons, but I trust in God. And everyone will know that it is God who has defeated you and your army today. And so we see the faithfulness of God represented in this young man. And because of that, God makes all of these promises to David and says, because you have had faith, because you have come, his son builds the temple. And he says that your descendants will establish a kingdom that will have no end. And now we fast forward to Christmas. In the Christmas story, we're in this season where it's been about 400 years. There's been no prophet. There's been no word from God. And I'm sure a lot of the people are saying, God made these promises to Abraham. God made these promises to David. And yet what has happened to these promises today? Is God still faithful? Or has our constant abandonment of his way actually broken his promises to us? And this is why I think it's really cool that one of the first verses, actually the first verse in the entire New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, says this. This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, the descendant of David and of Abraham. And so in this one line, Matthew, if you don't know this, is writing mostly to the Jewish people who are following Jesus. And so he writes this line to bring to their minds, to bring to their hearts the promises that were made to Abraham and to David, and to see that those promises are actually now being answered. God has not forgotten. God has not abandoned. God is here, and he will get us where he promised to take us. And whatever your world looks like right now, whatever you have been going through, if there are things in your life where your fear has paralyzed your faith, we can look at stories like this and see that God is faithful. And sometimes it doesn't happen in the time. I'm sure a lot of those people would have been like, well, I wish he did this 1,000 years ago for our grandparents, and we would be living the good life now. And yet, as God gives us freedom to navigate this world, sometimes we make the world messier and people around us make the world messier. And yet, in spite of that, God is still faithful. Do not allow your fear to pull you away from your faith and your faithfulness to do the things that God has asked you to do. In the midst of this Christmas story, like David, we have another young person, Mary, who is trusting that God will be faithful to get her through this crazy story, and Joseph, who's just trusting and coming alongside of her. And they hold the baby Jesus and lay him in a manger, the incarnation of God, Emmanuel, God with us. And as they lay and put him there, they only partially can grasp the significance of what is going on, that God, in his faithfulness, is bringing together the promises that he has made throughout all of history in the man of Jesus. And so now Jesus here, fully man, fully God, begins his journey and his life. And at this Christmas season, we reflect and give thanks for the fact that God did not forget what he had set up. He did not forget his promises, that God was faithful. And so we can have faith in God's faithfulness. A lot of times we can look to these scriptures and be like, oh yeah, that was great for then. But I think often we can forget the moments where God has been faithful for us, when we're facing hard situations or we're facing big problems, things that can seem like giants that are blocking us from actually trusting God and moving forward the way that God has called us to go. And in my life, there's so many stories. And as I had chatted with my wife about this idea of faith in God's faithfulness, especially at this Christmas season, we were reflecting back on the fact that our daughter is actually born Christmas Eve. It was our first child. And as we were going up to that season, we actually moved. Actually, both times we have had a kid. We've moved in the middle of the pregnancy. Do not recommend. And yet in the middle of that move, we lost contact with our doctor. The hospital we were supposed to go to was too far away. And the doctor's solution to this was to give us a giant folder and say, if you go into labor, just go to whatever hospital is closest to you and bring them this folder. They will read through it and figure it out. This did not inspire deep faith and confidence in my heart as a first-time parent. I wanted a doctor who knew us and knew what was going on, not a doctor who was figuring it out on the fly. And so we were really stressed, and I took that folder with me everywhere we went. It lived in the back seat of the car or in my backpack, or anywhere we went, that folder was with us. And yet as we got pretty close to the end of the pregnancy, we had a friend of a friend hear about the situation. She was a nurse, and she managed to convince the doctor to take us on as patients in the last minute. And the feeling of just relief that came over us, and we ended up going, and everything worked out really smoothly. And as we sat in the hospital on that Christmas Eve, feeling that sense of calm and relief, it was hard not to reflect on who God was and what had happened on that first Christmas. And we were just crying and sitting and just remembering that God, in big things and in small things, that He is with us, that He is faithful, and that because of that, we can put our faith in Him. So I don't know where you're at in your journey of faith. Maybe you're trusting God with everything, or maybe you've never trusted God at all. But I'm going to take a moment to just pray for you, and I ask that you would take some time to reflect and say, God, where can I put my faith in you more? Where do I need to see your faithfulness in my life? And if you've never chosen to follow Him, maybe today, in this moment, you can say, God, today I want to put my faith in you and trust that you will be faithful to guide me, and then make sure to reach out to someone else who is following Jesus and talk that through with them. God, I pray for every single person who is watching this video. God, I pray for the situations they are walking through, for whatever problems might be standing in their way, God, that you would bless them, that you would guide them, that you would show your faithfulness to them. Even if things don't work out the way that they might want, God, that you would give them a sense of your peace and your love in the midst of it. And so, God, we trust you. Help us to be faithful in our communities, in our neighborhoods, even if that just means bringing up the fact that we were at church, or bringing up the fact that we watched a video and saying, God, how can you use my conversations with the people around me to bring your kingdom here on earth? So God, we lift up all these things to you. Pray that you would use and guide your people and your creation. Thank you for your faithfulness in this Christmas season. In Jesus' name, amen.